Um, Welcome back to another deep dive. You've sent us an incredibly fascinating stack of sources to get through today.
Yeah, we have a really massive collection of texts here.
We do. We are unpacking historical, theological, and modern religious texts that all center around a very specific, highly provocative concept called Zadok revelatory worship.
It's a very striking term.
Right. And whether you consider yourself deeply religious, a total history buff, or you're just endlessly curious about human behavior and how ancient traditions collide with modern culture, there is something in these notes that will absolutely grab your attention.
It is a captivating collection of writings to sift through. I mean, the central theme across all these documents is this really sharp, unrelenting critique of modern church culture.
Yeah, unrelenting is a good word for it.
The author is drawing a stark contrast between the way religious services are often conducted today, which they basically describe as performing for a crowd, and an ancient, highly specific order of priests who are completely dedicated to seeking a true, unhindered spiritual presence.
So we are essentially looking at a framework that separates putting on a theatrical show from experiencing something genuinely holy.
Exactly. But before we jump into the deep end, it's important to set the stage for how we are approaching this material.
Right, because the sources you shared are filled with very passionate viewpoints, complex theological arguments, and even some really vivid personal visions experienced by the author.
Right. And our goal here is not to endorse the theology or, take a side on these religious viewpoints. We are looking at this through a strictly impartial lens.
Our mission is just to explore the texts, understand the underlying arguments, and convey the ideas in this original source material so you can see the complete picture.
Okay, let's unpack this. And to do that, we need to start with the foundational history.
Yeah, to understand this critique of the modern church, the texts actually take us way back to ancient Israel.
Right.
Specifically focusing on a group of people called the Levites.
Yes, the tribe of Levi. Following the Exodus from Egypt, they were set apart to handle the religious duties for the entire nation.
They maintained the tabernacle.
Right. They processed the animal sacrifices, and they were the ones responsible for teaching the law to the general public.
Basically, if it had to do with the mechanics of worship, they ran the operation.
They were the mediators between the people and the divine.
But I noticed the sources didn't hold back on their historical track record. They point out that over centuries, these Levitical priests developed a massive problem with unfaithfulness.
They really did.
The notes bring up the sons of Eli as a prime example of this corruption. What exactly were they doing that crossed the line?
Well, the texts point to a complete disregard for the sacredness of their role. These two priests, Hophni and Phinehas, they treated the entire sacrificial system with blatant contempt.
Just totally taking advantage of it.
Yeah, the historical accounts describe how they would essentially strong-arm the people to steal the best, choicest portions of the meat meant for holy sacrifices.
Just to feed themselves.
Exactly. They turned a sacred duty into a vehicle for personal greed and abuse of power.
And it wasn't just isolated incidents with a few bad actors either. The notes jump forward to the reign of King Ahaz to show how systemic it became.
Under King Ahaz, we see a total institutional failure. I mean, the Levitical priests actually allowed the doors of the temple to be shut entirely.
Wow.
Yeah. The texts highlight their fall into idolatry and
Sure.
specifically mention syncretism.
Let's pause on that term for a second. Syncretism. How are these sources defining that in this historical context?
It's the blending of different, often contradictory religious beliefs and practices.
Okay.
Instead of maintaining their distinct, set-apart traditions, the priests caved to cultural and political pressures. They started setting up altars for foreign gods right alongside their own.
Just mixing pagan practices into their worship to appease the king.
And fit in with the surrounding nations. It was the ultimate compromise.
Which sets the stage for the turning point, because amidst all this compromise, the narrative shifts to one specific family line within that broader tribe of Levi, the sons of Zadok.
Right. Zadok was a high priest who served during the reign of King David.
And while other priests were easily swayed by these cultural pressures or joined political rebellions, Zadok and his family remained fiercely loyal to David.
And to their original calling.
Right. Because of that unwavering faithfulness, the texts explain that God established a very specific, eternal covenant with these sons of Zadok.
What's fascinating here is how the prophet Ezekiel addresses this centuries later. In the book of Ezekiel, specifically in chapter 44, there is a vivid description of a divine demotion.
A divine demotion.
Yeah. Because the general Levites had repeatedly strayed and led the people into idolatry, God stripped them of their highest, most sacred privileges.
They were demoted to what the author calls a man-centered ministry, meaning they were still allowed to work in the temple, right?
They were. They were allowed to keep charge at the gates, do the heavy lifting, slaughter the sacrifices, and minister to the people.
Okay.
But the text explicitly bars them from coming near to God himself or entering the most holy places. Their focus was permanently shifted outward to the crowd.
But the Zadok priests got a completely different mandate in that same chapter.
Because the Zadokites kept their charge and remained faithful during the times of national rebellion, they were granted the exclusive right to enter the inner sanctuary.
So their ministry was not to the people.
No, their ministry was directly to God.
Yeah.
They were the ones trusted to offer the fat and the blood. And, importantly, they were tasked with teaching the people the difference between the holy and the profane.
The clean and the unclean.
Right.
It's a fascinating historical dichotomy. And this is exactly where the author takes this ancient concept from Ezekiel 44 and applies it directly to the modern church.
Yes, this is the core of their argument.
The central argument is that if you look at the vast majority of worship leaders today, they're functioning exactly like those demoted Levites.
It's a harsh comparison.
Very. Think about a typical modern church service. The author points out that the entire focus of the people on stage is directed at the crowd.
They are looking out at the congregation.
Trying to entertain, trying to keep everyone engaged, and managing the energy of the room rather than turning their focus inward and ministering directly to God.
The critique here is quite sharp. The author introduces a concept they call the sin of assumption.
The sin of assumption.
This is the ingrained habit where modern religious leaders just assume they know what God wants in a worship service without ever actually pausing to ask him.
They just follow a template.
Exactly. According to the sources, relying on human agendas, crafting a service based on what plays well to an audience, and assuming we know best is actually framed as a form of idolatry and rebellion.
It elevates human preference above divine direction.
It does.
And the sources outline 3 very specific ways that modern, heavily programmed church services are essentially shutting down any genuine spiritual presence.
Hindering, grieving, and quenching the spirit.
Let's break those down because the author uses some very recognizable examples. First is hindering.
Hindering is described as placing roadblocks in the way of a genuine spiritual encounter through rigid agendas.
Like strict time constraints.
Exactly. The texts specifically call out the Sunday morning schedule. If a service has to end exactly at noon so people can beat the traffic, the schedule is dictating the spiritual experience.
The author also points to the heavy reliance on emotional manipulation in charismatic churches.
Right.
Now, when the texts talk about charismatic churches, they are generally referring to denominations or congregations that emphasize expressive worship, raising hands, and the active presence of spiritual gifts. Right?
That is the exact environment the author is addressing. These are spaces where people expect to feel a high emotional connection.
But the critique is that leaders often try to manufacture that connection.
Using concert-like elements. The notes mention rigid set lists that can't be deviated from, fancy lighting cues, Vogue machines. The argument is that relying on these theatrical elements actually hinders true spiritual depth.
Then there is grieving the spirit. The sources define this as causing literal sorrow to the divine.
This happens through unconfessed sin or pride. But the author also highlights casual distractions.
The casual distractions example was wild to me.
The texts note that it is grieving to God when people are standing in a worship service, mouthing the words to a song, but their minds are completely wandering to what they're going to have for lunch afterward.
It just reflects a total lack of reverence for the space they're supposedly in.
Which leads to the third concept, quenching.
Right.
This is described as literally extinguishing a spiritual moment, usually out of a deep-seated discomfort with silence.
The pastoral urge to fill every single quiet moment with more human effort.
Exactly. If the music fades and there is a lull, someone immediately jumps on the microphone to say a prayer, or the band starts another song, just to keep the energy up and prevent the crowd from getting bored.
And this fear of silence leads to one of the most startling claims in the entire stack of sources.
It really is a bold assertion.
The author boldly asserts that the intense glory or the massive emotional highs felt in many of these heavily produced church services today are not actually the presence of God himself.
Often, the texts claim it is just the presence of angels, or in worst cases, false manifestations.
The author even states that angels have literally been seen to weep in these services.
Because a genuine moment of worship is prematurely cut off by a pastor saying amen just to stick to the printed bulletin.
It is a heavy theological indictment, and the author backs up this perspective with some incredibly vivid personal visions.
There's one specific narrative from the late 90s or early 2000s in the text that really illustrates this point.
The author describes having a night vision where they are standing in a local church.
The atmosphere in the room is totally charged, people are deeply emotional, and suddenly a sparkling, brilliant angel walks right into the room.
The congregation is amazed by it, but the author notices something is fundamentally wrong.
Right, the text describes the light emanating from this angel as tainted. It sparkles, it looks impressive to the naked eye, but the author senses it completely lacks true holiness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is illustrating a profound warning found in the New Testament about testing the spirits.
Right, testing the spirits.
When the author confronts this sparkling angel in the vision and aggressively demands to know if it was sent by Jesus, the angel shrinks down, loses its brilliance, and completely disappears.
The argument relies on scriptures that warn how Satan can masquerade as an angel of light.
The danger the author is highlighting is that these false, highly emotional experiences can easily stroke the human ego. They make the congregation feel good, they make the leaders feel powerful.
But they are entirely void of the true power needed to bring about any genuine repentance or lasting transformation.
Precisely.
It's a fascinating way to look at it. The author is essentially saying that chasing an emotional high leaves people incredibly vulnerable to deception.
And that brings us to another striking vision from the texts, this one recorded in 1999.
In this vision, the author sees a team of worshipers. Their praise is authentic, and it is physically ascending like thick smoke going straight up to God's throne. It's a beautiful image.
But then there's a natural lull in the music. Silence falls over the room.
And instead of waiting in that stillness, the leaders on the platform completely panic.
They get uncomfortable with the quiet and scramble to fill the void with new songs, relying entirely on their own human effort to keep the momentum going.
And the texts describe the immediate consequence of that panic.
The moment they rely on their own effort, the smoke detours. It stops ascending. The connection is broken.
And the Lord speaks to the author in this vision and explicitly calls this manipulation witchcraft.
This is correct.
I mean, witchcraft is a very intense word to use for someone just trying to lead a worship song.
It is an abrasive term, but within the context of these writings, the author is using a very specific definition.
How do they define it?
They're defining witchcraft as manipulation, specifically relying on human effort, coercion, or emotional hype to try and force a spiritual outcome.
So when leaders try to manufacture an experience for the crowd, using music theory and stage presence, rather than waiting obediently for divine direction.
The texts view this as the ultimate failure. It is relying on the flesh to do the work of the Spirit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the author doesn't just tear down the current system, they offer a completely different blueprint for how things should be done.
Yes, the countervision from 2013.
It outlines what this Zadok revelatory worship actually looks like in practice. In this vision, there is a small team of worshipers, but they aren't hyping up a crowd.
They are standing in complete, absolute stillness. The author notes their ears are metaphorically pressed to God's heart.
They refuse to play a single chord, sing a single note, or make any movement whatsoever until they are explicitly led by the Spirit.
And when they finally do receive that direction and move, the texts say they flow as one, completely unified.
And an intense fear of the Lord fills the room.
But the sources make it clear, this isn't just about having a more peaceful, contemplative church service. They frame this pure Zadok worship as a literal spiritual war strategy.
A war strategy. The author connects this modern vision back to the biblical story of King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles chapter 20.
That is the story where a massive coalition of armies is coming to attack Judah, and Jehoshaphat is completely outnumbered.
Right. But Jehoshaphat didn't lead his counterattack with swords or elite soldiers. He sent the singers and worshipers out to the front lines of the battle ahead of the army.
And the result of that radical obedience was that the enemy was thrown into confusion and defeated before the army even had to fight.
The texts argue that when Zadok revelatory worship is executed with that same kind of pure obedience, completely untainted by human agendas or the need to perform, It causes God's presence to manifest so powerfully that it doesn't just affect the room.
It fills entire cities and regions. In the author's vision, this pure worship actively displaces darkness and renders Satan completely powerless in those geographical areas.
The author sees this culminating in a radical reimagining of physical church spaces. They call these future locations altars of worship or threshing floors.
Let's unpack that term, threshing floors, because most people today don't have a background in ancient agriculture.
Right. What is the metaphor the author is leaning into here?
In the ancient world, a threshing floor was a hard, flat surface where you brought the newly harvested grain. You would crush the stalks, often by having oxen walk over them, to loosen the edible wheat from the inedible casing.
Then you would toss it all into the air.
And the wind would blow away the useless chaff, leaving only the pure grain behind.
The author is using this as a profound metaphor for crushing the human ego.
Exactly. These proposed worship centers are designed to separate the holy from the profane, blowing away the chaff of performance, ambition, and entertainment.
And the physical setup of these threshing floors reflects that total stripping away of the ego. The vision describes specialized worship centers with absolutely no preaching.
No church announcements, no platforms or stages elevating the musicians above the congregation.
The text even suggests that the Zadok priests might worship behind physical curtains or walls so that nobody in the room can look at them and get distracted by the human element.
The environmental design is intensely intentional. The texts mention there are no chairs or benches in the middle of the room to hinder movement. The seats are pushed entirely to the perimeter.
The sole focus of every single person in the room is ministering directly to God, just like the ancient Zadokites.
The idea is that by completely removing the human performance element and the safety net of a structured program, God's unhindered presence is invited in.
And that divine presence alone, not a sermon, not a perfectly timed song, is what heals and delivers the people who walk through the doors.
It eliminates the mediator role of a modern pastor and relies entirely on a direct encounter.
It is a radically different paradigm. But underneath all the deep history of the Levites, the intense visions of angels, and the blueprints for these threshing floors, the sources keep hammering home one foundational concept that ties it all together.
Yes, the first love relationship. The author is incredibly insistent that beyond all the theological deep dives and the sharp critiques of church structure, absolutely everything must be built on a foundation of one-on-one intimacy.
They refer to this as sitting in the secret place.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean in practical terms?
The argument is that you cannot be a true Zadok priest. You cannot discern the holy from the profane, and you certainly cannot lead anyone else in any capacity unless you have first surrendered your own ego and cultivated a deep personal relationship in private.
Without that secret place intimacy, that first love, all the external religious structures, all the beautiful songs, all the massive gatherings are completely in vain.
The public expression must be a mere overflow of the private devotion.
Let's do a quick recap of the journey we just took through these sources. We started with the ancient divide between the Levitical priests who were demoted to ministering to the crowd and the Zadok priests who earned the right to minister directly to God.
Then we explored the author's sharp critique of modern entertainment-driven church services.
Looking at how the sin of assumption and the reliance on fog machines and rigid schedules can hinder, grieve, and quench true spiritual experiences.
We broke down the visions of tainted angels and the concept of performance as witchcraft.
And finally, we unpacked the visionary call for Zadok revelatory worship, a strategy built on absolute stillness, threshing floors that strip away the ego, and a foundational first love relationship.
This raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the walls of any church or ancient temple.
How so?
The texts we explored today heavily critique the human urge to perform, the reliance on manipulation, and the fear of silence. If we take this Zadok framework of stripping away the performance to find true authenticity and apply it to our modern secular lives, it points directly at our digital landscape.
Oh, that's a great point.
We live in an era where social media algorithms constantly demand that we act like those demoted Levites, always facing the crowd, always curating an image, always filling the silence with new content just to maintain engagement and prove our worth.
Performing for the algorithm.
Exactly. Think about your own digital footprint and your daily interactions. How much of your energy is spent frantically performing for an algorithm or an audience?
And what would a Zadok approach to your digital life look like?
What would happen if you stopped performing for the crowd and only cultivated what is deeply, quietly authentic in the secret place?
That is an incredibly challenging paradigm to consider, whether you are looking at a church stage or a smartphone screen. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the sources. Keep asking questions, keep challenging the status quo, and keep exploring the deeper layers of the world around you. We'll catch you on the next one.